Thursday, April 29, we are on part 28 of the Miracles of Jesus Christ. Dear Diary, after a good long tour of the Wailing Wall, we're ready to go to our next stop on today's tour. That's the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. We are able to walk around the outside of the museum, and then we take our time touring inside. We're not on a guided tour today, but it's more of a tour as you like experience. I have to say, I think we were all so overloaded that for us, we did not really absorb much of the information at the museum. I know Natalie and I didn't, and Mom was content to find a seat and sit and people watch. One of her favorite pastimes. Natalie strolled around. She didn't remember anything she saw. We talked about it later. Unfortunately, I was the same. I don't remember much of the last stop on our tour, except that we walked around outside the perimeter of the museum. That was really neat. And then we walked through the various rooms filled with items and information. A lot of the people in the group did the same thing my mom did. They found a bench and they people watched. I think we're all just maxed out of touring and viewing and grasping and understanding. Plus, our emotions have been on such a roller coaster this past 6 days. All the places we have been able to see that are so rich in biblical history from both the Old and the New Testament. We did spend about 2 hours at the museum, and Benny fulfilled his dream of exhausting us beyond all comprehension so that we sleep soundly our last night in Israel. And if it weren't the fact that we're all really, really hungry, we might have fallen asleep on the bus on the way back to the hotel. Mom and I looked for some snack machines in the museum that were as important to us as the art that graced the walls, according to my belly. But we could not find a vending machine to save our lives. Right now, I think I'd even have eaten the fish with the big eyes glaring at me. Mark 8, 1-21. In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they are continued with me 3 days and they haven't anything to eat. If I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint along the way. Some of them have come from very far. The disciples answered Jesus, well, how can we satisfy people with bread in the wilderness? And he said, how many loaves do we have? They said, we have 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and he gave thanks and he broke them. And he gave them to the disciples before, as he had done, and they set them before the multitude. Now they did find a few fish. The Lord blessed them as well, and he also set them before the multitude. So they ate as they were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. This time there were 4,000. He finally sent them away, and immediately the Lord gets into his boat with his disciples. Then the Pharisees came and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. And Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. And he left them. He got into the boat again, and they departed to another side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they didn't have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. Jesus charged them and said, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, it's because we took no bread. But Jesus knew what they were talking about, and he said, why do you worry about not having bread? Do you not perceive? Do you not understand? Are your hearts still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? You do not remember that when I broke up the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of fragments we took up? They said, well, we took 12. And Jesus said, and when I just broke recently the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets did you take up? And the disciples answered, we took 7. And Jesus said, how is it you do not understand? So before we dig into this miracle, I want to address the fact that there are those that argue that the feeding of the people was one miracle in the Bible, and it was put in there twice by Matthew and Mark. Part of the argument is that neither Luke nor John had the second feeding listed. Well, that's the same as we said many of the disciples' postings of works and miracles of Jesus coming from different human personalities and writings. They don't all have the same stories. They don't all show the same works of Christ, and there are times when their stories are slightly deviated from each other. And then there are the Bible scholars that note that Matthew did that. Matthew himself actually wrote about some miracles twice in his writing. That was Matthew's repetitive style. And I agree with them on that. I found that out for myself. But let's go back to the end of this miracle. Jesus puts all these questions to bed. He says to the disciples, don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets? And there were 12. And he says, and when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets did you get? And they said, 7. Clearly, Jesus speaks of 2 separate times when he fed huge amounts of people. It makes sense. Jesus's ministry was 3.5 years. Of course, there were probably other times that he did the same thing. Maybe not for as great amount of people, but that was part of what came along with following Jesus. He had compassion. He wasn't going to send children home with empty bellies, just as he doesn't send us spiritually with empty bellies. So it makes sense that he's kind of poking the disciples in their lack of faith, because they had 2 of these great foodie moments. If you're a foodie person and you like to do the food shows, these were foodie moments. And still they had a hard time understanding what Jesus was saying. The crowds followed Jesus. We talked about this, and they did so on the spur of the moment. They heard he was in town, they took off. Nobody ever prepared, because when they were around Jesus, they were just mesmerized. There was something about Christ, just as there's something about him today. Otherwise, why would the gospel of Jesus hang on through 2,000 years? The only other leader in the future that will draw people to him at some point in an extreme like this will be the Antichrist. And he will draw them at first as a leader of love and hope and ability, and he will give great hope to the world. We're going to hit some kind of a crisis. We're working on that now, behind the scenes in the spiritual world. And this leader will come out, and he will at first bring great hope. It doesn't last long. The Antichrist does not have the capability of Christ. It doesn't last. But he will also draw people in that same way. So back to Jesus. Jesus feeds the hungry masses in the same way as before, with order. He has them all sit. He's not going to have them run for the food line and the banquet line. We all know those people that elbow their way through the banquet line. They're incredibly rude. Jesus wasn't having that. He says, sit. And they sit. And then he blesses the food, which is the proper order. And then he begins to break it, and the disciples begin passing it out. And then the extra is collected. They don't waste any. Now, the fact that the disciples only had 1 loaf later and they forgot to take bread shows that this food, both occasions and perhaps others, was probably just distributed then to the hungry in the town that was closest to. It was like a mobile food bank. That's the practicality of Christ. He's very practical while doing his miracles. And it's important because it sparks a whole conversation later that Jesus says to them, because he go, oh, we only brought 1 loaf of bread, blah, blah, blah. And the practicality of Christ spurs a further conversation. Also, it shows that the Pharisees were up to no good. The Pharisees had seen miracle after miracle, and now they're also stalking Christ, because Jesus gets in a boat after the feeding of the people, and then he goes. But it shows the Pharisees followed. In whatever way they followed him, and then they started poking. They wanted a better miracle. They wanted something like Elijah's fire from heaven. They wanted that big barbecue moment where the fire came down and swapped up. Well, it's a good thing Jesus didn't do that, because they might have gotten swapped up with the fire, which they weren't thinking very clearly, because the idol-worshiping priests got sucked up in that time. Did the Pharisees really want to see Jesus provide a sign? Heavens, no. Oh, my word, no. If Jesus was getting to masses with these quiet miracles, healing a blind man as he walks down the street, healing the 10 lepers out in the field, what would he have done if he'd have had a barbecue like that? It would have brought the world as the Pharisees knew it to a standstill. No, they were just negative. Whatever Jesus said, if he'd have said it was a beautiful blue sky, they'd have said, well, it's got a hint of red in it. It looks like a little bit of a storm is coming. They lied, they poked, they prodded, because they were of their father, the devil. Satan followed Jesus every step on the earth, and I believe Satan did it personally himself. He wasn't leaving that to any of his minions. That's just my personal thoughts, but I'm putting them out there. Christ frustrated the leaders the way they were trying to frustrate him. He was very calm in his answers. These leaders were just what Jesus called them. They were the sons of the devil. Remember, it was Satan who first tempted Jesus in the desert just before he started his ministry. It was Satan who said, oh, if you're really the Son of God, toss yourself off this mountain. If you're really the Son of God, make a rock turn into bread, blah, blah, blah. And Jesus said to the leaders of the church, you are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do. That's found in John chapter 8, verse 38. Christ was 100% accurate, and the leaders proved that he was accurate over and over because of their constant attacks, constantly coming after the earthly side of Christ. And he got tired. He got sick of it. And when it says Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit, that's why. He refused to give them what they wanted. Jesus' miracles were never associated with grandeur. Never. Christ was not David Copperfield making elephants magically disappear from a room with smoke and mirrors. His miracles were true. They happened as they were stated. They were thoughtful. They were designed to make life easier and happier for one person at a time. And that's how we are to share the gospel. Most of us are never going to be Billy Graham. We're never going to be Billy Sunday. We're going to be one person at a time. Because that's how Jesus did it. He showed mercy, compassion, and goodness. He showed it to a sometimes loveless generation, like the Pharisees and Sadducees and the religious leaders and the teachers of the law who were never satisfied. It was never enough. And that is what Jesus experiences in his being when he sighs. He's starting to become physically tired. The earthly Jesus, the side of him that is earthly and fully man, is tired. And his daddy knew this. In the next chapter of Mark, chapter 9, we see that Jesus goes to the mountain. He takes with him only James and John and Peter, and he is transfigured for a time with just those disciples around him. That's a time of refreshing for Jesus. It's a physical time of uplifting. It's like he went and got a B12 shot on adrenaline. It's a time of spiritual food. It's a time of spiritual rest. It's a time of uplifting of Christ's soul. It's a time of going back to his dad, his father, and getting the comfort he needed to finish this long earthly journey. We all get tired. We all get hungry. We all get exhausted. We all get out of sorts. Our guts get worked up. Our spirits sigh deeply in our bodies. This visual of Jesus feeling these same things is such a blessing. If God can get sick of this world and the evil in it, not the people, but the evil moving it, then we're going to get sick of it as well. But this is a visual for us, a reminder that when we get to that moment, we go to the Father. We get food, the spiritual kind. We get a time of spiritual rest, a time of uplifting for our souls. And we get the great encouragement that only comes from the Lord of hosts, El Elyon. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and give you his wonderful shalom. See you tomorrow.